usually happen every week at 4 p.m. with some exceptions. Today's seminar, we have the pleasure of hosting Dr. Anthony Waldron, who is currently the lead author on the 30 by 30 economic analysis project, which brings together over 100 researchers across 10 disciplines to examine the economic impact of the proposed CBD target to protect 30% of the planet from nature. The project is funded by National Geographic and the Campaign for Nature, and as most of you know, Anthony is based at the Cambridge Conservation Initiative, and you may have met him already. Today he'll talk to us about protecting 30% of the planet for nature, costs, benefits, and economic implications. To address this topic, the research team of the project has developed 6 scenarios, including many industries and the impacts of many industries, which Anthony will talk about. Anthony's presentation on this project at the Center for Energy, Environment, and Natural Resources Governance last year was a very first event I ever attended at the DAB. So I'm looking forward to see how it has evolved since last year. I'm very glad that so many of you joined. The presentation, Anthony's presentation, will last approximately 40 minutes, and then we'll leave enough time at the end for questions, if you have any. And you can still post in the chat in the meantime, and then I can make a note to ask them Anthony in the end, or you can open your camera and microphone and ask themselves. And so Anthony, if you'd like to begin.
Should I start speaking?
Yes, please. Welcome.
Good afternoon, everyone, and thanks for the very kind invitation to speak. If I cough from time to time, it's not because I've got COVID. It's because I'm actually allergic to my own house, which isn't normally an issue until you start spending 22 hours of every day in it. So this is what's happening at the moment. So I may be a little hoarse, but I'll do my best. As was said, there is essentially a proposal before the CBD at the moment to expand the protected part of the planet to 30% of the planet. And it's starting to pick up some traction. A number of governments are already committing to it, but there was a lot of anxiety amongst the government parties as to the general idea: if we take 30% of the planet sort of out of production, then what are the economic consequences of that? Can we do it? And how bad would it be? And so they came to the Campaign for Nature and National Geographic, who came to me, and they said, can you work out both the sort of economic consequences and also the costs and the benefits of doing this? And can you do it in a year? And so I said, right, I'll give it a go. I might need some help. And so many of you might have had me at some point in the past year trying to twist your arm into helping me. And if you did, thank you very much. I'm going to attempt to share my screen now. Right. So if you think about it, there's 3 things that you would just automatically expect to see if we suddenly protect 30% of the planet, which is the equivalent of doubling the amount that we protect at the moment on the land, and something like quintupling what we do on the oceans. The first thing you're going to expect to see is if you double the amount of land that you're sort of taking out of production, people will just assume you're going to make an economic loss. And that was the big concern. The second thing is you would expect people to say, but there's ecosystem services and they have a dollar value too. And that will be enormous. So there'll be this huge dollar value for ecosystem service value that is going to be there if you try and protect more. And the third thing you would expect is going to cost a huge amount of money. So as said, now what I've just talked about there breaks down the economic consequences into 2 rather clear buckets for ordinary people. The first one you might call real money. So this is if an industry produces goods and sells them, then obviously it gets income, real money for it. The other thing is what we call economic value. When we talk about the loss of economic value, sometimes we're talking about things like, you know, the future consequence of putting carbon into the atmosphere, and therefore that gets a dollar value. But in many cases, nobody's paying you that dollar value. Sometimes we call these shadow prices for that reason, because they're often, but not always, different from actual money going into your bank account. And so in general, I actually carried out two analyses. One of the financial consequences, which we might call the real money, and one of the broad sense economic consequences, which includes this idea of shadow values. The main measure of real money is something which is called the economic output. Output is simply the total value of all the goods and services that you produce. Right. Now, when you're talking about economic consequences, you of course need to think, well, who's going to get hit by the consequences? And if you think about it, most protected areas tend to be, by definition, in natural or semi-natural areas, with some interesting European exceptions where we try and protect bits of farmland and things like that. But in general, even if it's protecting farmland, the consequences of protection are likely to fall upon rural areas or rural industries, if you like. And if you're going out to sea, it's going to fall on coastal industries. And also, it's going to tend to go towards developing economies for the simple reason that they tend to have an awful lot more natural habitat left than places like the Netherlands. So the main industries that are likely to be affected in a rural and coastal setting are agriculture, forestry, fisheries, of course, and tourism, which is, again, quite often occurring in coastal and natural areas. And that includes tourism going into protected areas themselves. So that's rather interesting, because that's, as it were, an economic benefit of a protected area rather than it causing a loss to another industry. So essentially, you can think of protected areas as an industry in their own right, generating certain amounts of income, and that's going to be important. There's also oil and mining, but that is, although important, it's spotty and hard to work with, because it requires you to predict where oil and mining finds are going to be in the next 30 years. And if I knew that, I wouldn't be working in this job. Right. So how do we go about this? Well, essentially, the first problem was they said 30% of the planet. And well, I said, well, which 30%? I can't tell you what the economic consequences are until you tell me where you're protecting. And the answer was, well, we don't really know. So the first thing I did in early 2019 was run around people saying, I need scenarios for where you might want to protect 30%. And some of them were sort of off the shelf, and some of them we had to develop. So we will look at the scenarios later, but just so you know, there's 6 terrestrial versions of 30% of the land and 5 marine 30%, so 30% of the ocean. And just to emphasize, 30% means 30% of the land and 30% of the ocean.
Yeah.
Hello? No. Right. So firstly, we have the financial consequences, the real money. So what's the change in outputs and profits and revenues for things like agriculture, forestry, and fisheries? So to do that, I managed to get the help of the people who run all 4 of the integrated assessment models. These are the kind of things that are often used in climate change models. And what they do is project land use change and the economic consequences of land use change. Then they don't really have a strong forestry component. So there's also another model called the Global Forest Products Model that's currently being run out of the US Forestry Service. I managed to get them on board with some help from Oxford University doing forest biomass. For fisheries, we managed to get 3 teams who run the marine equivalent of those land models. So you might call it an ocean use model. And there are 3 of those. They're called ocean ecosystem models or marine ecosystem models. And they also sometimes project the economic consequences and certainly the fish consequences. Then for the tourism part, which is specifically the tourism in protected areas, we carried out a new analysis of global protected area tourism, which included a total analysis of all social media posts over about 13 years from protected areas to give you a trend in visitation rates, and then a deep dive into the literature of what the tourists were spending and therefore the sort of revenues that you might expect from them. And then that had to be statistically projected into the future again. That's just the real money. So that's real money in agriculture, forestry, fisheries, and tourism. Lots and lots of different models. A bit of a kitchen sink approach, you might say. Then you get the broad sense economic consequences, what we often think of as ecosystem service values. Now, unsurprisingly, it wasn't possible to take 11 different scenarios and work out the change in every single ecosystem service value for all of them. And so what we had to do is focus on the ones which drive the value and are best studied for that reason. And those are forest, and especially tropical forest, mangroves, and to some degree coral reefs. Although in the end, what happened with coral reefs is so much of a coral reef's value lay in its tourism value that to avoid double counting, we just incorporated that into the tourism analysis. In future, we might add grasslands and temperate forests. And then finally, the final question was, well, how much would it cost to even protect 30% of the planet in terms of management and having to buy land and that sort of thing? And so we carried out a new analysis of the costs of running entire national protected area systems under all of the different scenarios. Then we also incorporated land purchase values, which acts as a sort of compensation cost if you need to protect an area that might otherwise have been productive. And then finally we developed a form of, so all of these costs, if you essentially wanted to farm a place but you can't because it's protected, that's called the opportunity cost to you. But opportunity costs are usually put in dollar values. Now think about it, if you're something like an indigenous group that lives off the natural resources of an area, then there's no money changing hands in that respect. And so economics would normally be completely blind to that situation. So we had to develop a sort of non-economic opportunity cost for indigenous peoples and local communities who might be harvesting the local resources directly. That, as you might imagine, took a lot of help. So this is a sort of broad overview of the groups of people. So most of the major NGOs helped out. A lot of people around Cambridge, the WCMC, universities of Oxford, Singapore, Queensland, Maryland, etc., etc. EASA, the terrestrial integrated assessment modelers, and so on. There's something like Andy Purvis at the Natural History Museum is now trying to incorporate our scenarios into the Dasgupta review of biodiversity values. So here are the 114 names. Just thank you enormously to everybody on there. I could not possibly have done this on my own, obviously. And just here's the full list, if you're interested, of all the institutions that they belong to. I'll just to give you a sense of the size of the effort. So, what were the conclusions? Well, remember, first we had the real money financial consequences, and then we had the broad sense economic consequences. The overall conclusion, well, in terms of real money, economic output wouldn't really change very much. That might seem more, and in fact, it might slightly increase. So just to be specific, and I'll explain this later, it was slightly positive for gross output and a more neutral for net output. And then the broad sense economic value, including ecosystem service values, that again would increase, but not by gigantic amounts that you might have seen flung around, like people saying $125 trillion of ecosystem service value. We had a few hundred billion. So this is what the results look like in summary. So if you remember, I said there were a number of scenarios. So if I first go to the top left, then what we've got here, the ref, is essentially what happens if you don't go to 30%, if you just stay where we are. And what you're seeing here is the gross output or the revenues in 2050 expected under the different scenarios. And as you can see, all of the scenarios actually have a higher expected level of output or revenue than if you did nothing. And if you look over to the right-hand side of it, so top right, you'll see that the percentage increase in those revenues was somewhere between 1 and 8%. Now, those are gross revenues, just to emphasize. If you go down to the bottom left here, then you can see it broken down by industry. So what you'll notice is that the yellow is essentially mostly made up of the tourism value that you might expect in protected areas by having more protected areas that tourists can visit. And I should very quickly emphasize, this doesn't assume that if you double protected areas, you double tourism. It's far more sophisticated than that. It's based on actual tourist demand and how it would change with greater accessibility of protected areas. So you'll see that the tourist income obviously goes up a bit by perhaps 1 to 200 billion globally. Then oddly, the forestry and agricultural revenues also go up. So this is the money received by the industries for the services and goods that they produce. The only thing that really goes down, you can hardly see it's in blue. There's little dots of blue underneath the line, and that's fisheries. So fisheries would temporarily be reduced in the size of economic output by suddenly protecting 30% of the sea. Now, the next bit's kind of important. Yes, gross output goes up. So in other words, the amount of money that the agricultural producer industry receives for its food goes up. And that looks really great. Unfortunately, so does the cost of producing it. So to some degree, you need a little bit more land. And because you've introduced an element of scarcity by reducing the part of the planet that you can farm, then costs overall slightly rise with scarcity. So what you see in the gray chart here is what happens if you try and take into account costs. Now, this is specifically for agriculture because we don't yet have a forestry cost model. And it's very difficult to do a proper cost model for protected areas. But in general, they should all be about the same. And so what you're seeing here is that more or less, it's pretty close to not much happening. So in some of these integrated assessment models, there's a slight increase in the net output. You might think of this as profit if you're a non-economist. And in some cases, there's a bit of a drop. But the drop is about 1%. Now, that's equivalent to about $10 billion a year in global output. If you look, the actual gain in tourism output is a lot more than 10 billion. And so what you end up with is you switch your economy slightly more towards tourism and slightly away from food production, while still being able to produce enough food, I would hesitate not to say. And then essentially in global terms, you get slightly better off, but it's easier just to think of it as not a great deal happens. Really, your global economy overall is very similar to the way it was before. It's just that the revenue is coming from slightly different sources. And if you look at the final little chart on the bottom right, that shows you also the costs. So the costs are the little blue bars here. And the point here is simply to show you two things. Firstly, that the costs are generally quite a bit lower than either the revenues, which is the orange, or indeed the shadow value, the ecosystem service value, which is the yellow. And I don't want to go too much into the gray bars because that would take up a lot of time. Ask me about it afterwards if you want. Take home from this is the costs are not that high compared to the benefits. Now, I've been talking a lot about these 6 scenarios. And as you can see, in general, it doesn't make a huge amount of difference which scenario you use. The conclusions are similar, but let me just now explore what the scenarios mean and how they affect the conclusions at a finer scale. So these are the names of the 6 scenarios. I'll just go through them quickly. 3 conditions and harsh political reality are essentially business as usual. They both take an attitude that you only really put protected areas in places where they're generally not required for productive use. So some of you may be aware that we already tend to put protected areas in remote places that we don't really want to use for agriculture, or on top of mountains, or in deserts. Like the vast majority of the protected part of the US is a desert, for example. So 3 conditions follows through on this remote wilderness idea. Essentially, all it does is protect the remaining wilderness, but that tends to be Siberia, the Arctic, the Sahara, plus also, of course, important things like the Congo and the Amazon forest. Harsh political reality is a little bit different in the sense that it, instead of focusing on wilderness habitat, it focuses on where species are and says, if you wanted to save as many species as possible without ever affecting agriculture or forestry, where would you put it? The third one, biodiversity or wilderness, is a sort of consensus. So there are 2 threads that tend to run through conservation. One focuses on things like species richness, biodiversity in that sense, and one focuses on the idea that there are wild places remaining and we should keep those wild. So that's more of a wilderness idea. And the biodiversity wilderness essentially takes the consensus of both those approaches, puts them together, removes the overlap in a single map and says that's where you need to go. You get both biodiversity and wilderness in one big solution. Then you get a compromise. So I will come to the compromise last. Let's go to save species and global deal for nature. The 2 at the bottom are essentially what would happen if you let biologists rule the planet and just said you can have exactly where you want to go, biologically speaking, either to save species or to meet some other set of criteria. So the global deal for nature is a consensus portfolio of different priorities, things like the key biodiversity areas, the existing protected areas, the 0 extinction sites, high beta diversity areas, places you need for wild mammals of very large size to continue to roam, that sort of thing. But both of the 2 at the bottom are essentially biologically focused scenarios. And the one in the middle, the biodiversity production compromise, is simply what happens if you try to make a compromise between letting the biologists have it all their own way and letting the production economists have it all their own way. So it's somewhere in the middle. So if I just go backwards, then you'll see that all of these figures sort of align, so that if you like, on the left, it's the most economically and production focused. Things like the three conditions, things like allow agriculture to come first and only then try and preserve biodiversity. The ones on the right, the SSC and GDN, are the ones where you're allowing the biologists to have completely free rein. And the ones in the middle are more either compromise solutions, or in some ways the mixed biodiversity and wilderness is a strange compromise. So what you see here, interestingly, is that as you increase the biological focus, then what happens is that the overall output that you get back goes up. Now, this is for a very specific and interesting reason. Essentially, when you focus on biological need, you end up preserving a lot of places that are close to people. When you focus on going to remote places like the middle of the Sahara, you're not imposing any opportunity cost on things like agriculture or forestry, but nor do you get a great deal of tourism. And therefore, all of the economic value that tourism might bring has disappeared. And so you get this interesting trade-off where you can either have very little tourist income, but no hit to your agricultural income, for example, or a slight hit to your agricultural income, but a lot more tourist income. And that's why the more biologically focused scenarios tend to get a higher gross output. On the other hand, if you go to the gray bars, what you'll see is that the places where the net output is most convincingly, definitely negative, is also in the most biologically focused places. So it would be fairer to say biologically focused solutions do generate a small economic loss when you account for the increase in all the costs that scarcity imposes. But it's of the order of maybe a small number of tens of billions of dollars a year, and it's still outweighed by what you get back in increased tourism. This is just real money financial outcomes, as I said. And if you just look at the cost area, what you will also note, unsurprisingly, if you look at the blue bars, is that the places that are placed in extremely remote areas have much lower costs than places which are positioned close to people and therefore with much more competition for the land and sea and pressure upon them. Just as a final thing, since we were projecting all of these forward in time, so all of these figures you've seen are typically for 2050, so allowing 20 years for the policy consequences to play out. But we also looked at the growth rates that you would expect over that period of time. This just shows a subset of those scenarios, but it doesn't really matter because all you can see is that in yellow, the growth rate you expect for what we're calling the PA and nature sector, driven by things like nature tourism, is going to be of the order of about 4 to 6% per year. Whereas the growth rates in agriculture and forestry, almost irrespective of what else you do to the planet, are going to be about 0.5% a year. So if you're a government looking to prioritize rapidly growing parts of your economy, it makes more sense to look towards nature tourism aspects than it does towards expanding agriculture. And just to make the point, fisheries has been in steady decline and would continue to be in decline rather than in growth, almost irrespective of what you do. But as you'll see, you sort of rescue that. So fisheries is a slightly different kettle of fish, so to speak. With fisheries, what happens is that because you're protecting areas which probably are already being fished, that's different from protecting a forest and saying you can't farm this forest in the future. When you protect a sea, well, you're not really talking about the future. You're talking about you can't fish here right now. And so that causes a bigger immediate economic downturn, if you like. And so what happens is you get a downturn, but then because you've protected a large part of the stocks and they're being overfished, then the stocks start to recover. So this is standard practice in fisheries. You essentially, if you take an overfished area, you close it off for a period of time to allow the stocks to recover. And then it acts as a nursery system. And then the fish are supposed to then either be refished or they might spread out into the areas that you're still permitting fishing on. The easiest way to look at this is actually the graph on the right. So the top two lines on the graph on the right show either the consequences of doing nothing, except in 2020, making marine protected areas actually protect fish, because at the moment, most of them don't. So essentially what we say is in 2020, instead of having maybe 2% of the ocean properly protected, we'll maybe jump up to about 7%. What happens then is there's a brief increase as that declaring the full 7% protection starts to bite, but then it turns out not to be enough. And after 2040, the fisheries start to decline again. So if you see in the end of the upper lines, they go up briefly and then they go down again. Whereas what happens if you protect immediately, then obviously you get an immediate short-term sacrifice of economic output. So you simply can't get enough fish initially. But what happens over time is that by the end of the 2040s, you're starting to recover and you actually overtake the fisheries output that you would have had if you'd done nothing. So there is short-term pain for long-term gain in fisheries. But just to emphasize, the alternative is essentially just an ongoing decline. As I said, finally, we looked at this sense of opportunity costs that have no economic dollar value, things like indigenous peoples. What happens if you take a protected area, as has occasionally occurred, and essentially say indigenous peoples no longer have the right to carry out their livelihoods in that protected area? And so that would obviously represent an opportunity cost of enormous scope. So we're not just talking about the ability to gather food, we're talking about displacement, violation of human rights, cultural destruction, destruction of spiritual values, loss of your sense of identity. Now this is important because the 30% proposal could double the amount of overlap that currently exists between these indigenous and community groups and protected areas. And just to say that the CBD itself emphasizes the need to actually take this seriously. You need to properly have a rights framework that respects the indigenous and community groups. They must have free or prior informed consent. So that means even if you want to make it a protected area, they have to completely understand what that means and sign up to it before you do it. And there's a push for the other area-based effective conservation measures to be used in indigenous areas, which is essentially where you recognize that conservation is occurring there, but it's not oddly the primary purpose. If you like, the primary purpose would be to have an indigenous area, and it happens to be good for conservation because you have shared values. That's a rather poor legal explanation. I do apologize if anybody works in FBIC and OECM. I have expressed that better in the past. there is also some anecdotal evidence that if you co-manage with indigenous and community groups, it brings down the costs. But that requires a lot more research because there are ethical issues around essentially saying, if indigenous groups are going to do it just because they want to, maybe we don't need to pay them. Why would you not pay them the same as you would pay to issues there? And well, that's all. So obviously a project of this scope, I can't go into enormous detail, and I've just tried to give you a flavor of the sort of conclusions that we came to, and happy to take questions.
Thank you very much, Anthony. That was really a good talk. So if anyone, we can, I can give the floor to you one by one, so you can ask them. In the meantime, there was one question I had, and I know, Anthony, that this is a very broad project, so the answers are not necessarily going to be specific, but it's an exercise to show overall what the landscape will look like with protected areas. And I was wondering, in terms of agriculture, what assumptions have been made when it comes to how consumption will evolve in the future? And when you said that costs will increase, is it because the land use of agriculture will remain constant as we go forward? Is this what happening to the agricultural sector?
So the agricultural models all apply to the shared socio-economic pathway 2. They are basically some of bending the curve. If any of you are familiar, we're assuming that not a great deal will change over the next 20 years. Given money and time enough, which we didn't have, we could have tested different assumptions, but nobody got paid on this, and so this is as much as we could do. It's hard to know what the impact, I mean, you can guess what the impact would be, obviously, if you're reducing consumption by some magic combination of more efficient agriculture than otherwise expected, and reduced food waste, or if everybody suddenly went vegan, then obviously the scarcity would reduce, and you'd end up getting slightly better economic benefit in the agricultural sector, and you probably wouldn't have even 10 billion opportunity costs. You might have almost zero. But the four models all take different approaches to how project potential, you know, it's a full system where you've got consumption changing, prices are changing, behaviors changing, and use then changes in response, etc. But there's a limit to how many tweaks you can make and keep asking the same question, because it takes a month to even run one of them. So.
Thank you. I think we can put the questions from the audience. The first one was from Harriet. She's asking, what is meant by tourism? Does this include some evaluation of leisure time and well-being?
No. So tourism is specifically, so this goes back to the difference between financial, if you like, real money and economic value. So often you have these indirect measures of leisure values, like how much did you spend on driving your car to the park, things like that. But the tourism itself is only the direct economic output, so the sort of stuff that gets counted in GDP at the moment. So it's done by going through the national records for protected area tourist visits and how much income they generated, and then applying a forward projection model based on social media trends inside protected areas, corrected for usage in social media year on year. And so you sort of get a sense of how many people might go there in the future and how much they might spend. And therefore that's the economic output. it's cashy money, it's real money. Yeah, the leisure is to some degree slightly reflected in some of the tropical forest. So the tropical forest valuation is based on what's called a meta-regression of all the different ecosystem service valuation, which takes all the different possible things that a forest might contribute without many of them actually generating cash. And one of them is leisure, and that's built into that one. So we're not really accounting for the leisure value in non-tropical areas at the moment, but it does account for the leisure value in tropical areas.
Yeah, thank you, Anthony. I think we can move forward to the next question. It's by Mariana. I saw you rephrased it further down. So for countries that are not used to base their economies in protected areas, is there an economic cost and sort of investment contemplated for this shift?
Sorry, can you say that again?
Yes, it's for countries that are not used to base their economies in natural protected areas. Is there an economic cost, kind of an investment contemplated for this shift?
I mean, sorry, I mean like kind of an investment for tourism, like in some developing countries, natural protected areas, they don't have like infrastructure for tourism like at this time. So I was wondering if the study considers like kind of an investment for that in those countries.
So yes and no. It would be very difficult, and just to emphasize, we had like about 10 months to do this whole thing. You're perfectly right, and one of the arguments we're making is that essentially there will be upfront costs, and those are typically met in the global south by something called biodiversity aid, which is essentially just charity. People saying, you've got some nice biodiversity, here's some money to protect it. Biodiversity aid is much, much smaller than something called development aid, which is the money given to developing countries to help them develop their economies more. And the argument is that it would be perfectly possible from the models for protected areas to start essentially generating income, but they would need investment. And that investment would typically have to come from development aid. But I can't tell you exactly how much in each country.
Thank you.
Perhaps it would be easier to ask these questions in this way. So I was wondering,
Sure.
Paul Morling, would you ask to ask your question directly to Anthony? Okay, if not, I can ask it directly. So Paul's question was how to relate your analysis to the ecological footprint measure.
Right. There are many ways. It's in there. So in fact, it partly predicts the costs, oddly. But I see what you mean otherwise.
Sorry, can you hear me now? Sorry, it's
Yes.
Paul. And I don't want to take up too much time, but one thing, thank you very much for such a fantastic presentation. And it really is your reference to Dasgupta, and he is going to frame everything in the context of the ecological footprint, which tells us we're currently overshooting 1.7. Therefore, to get back to 1 requires a big reduction in consumption or reducing the sort of resource intensive consumption. And as we're arguing here, we don't need to get back to 1 planet, we need to get to 0.7 of the planet to spare 30% for nature. Now, on the face of it, the bald kind of analysis would suggest you need a real big reduction in consumption or a big improvement in the resource intensity of consumption. Mm-hmm. That's really how we're going to connect that to what Dasgupta is going to say to make use of your analysis.
Yeah, I mean, I'm sorry, it's very difficult to draw very precise links between those two. And Partha knows that or rather the Treasury Department knows that I have some issues with the ecological footprint, because it seems to me that it's based entirely on the sunlight falling on the planet without allowing for the possibility of any other energy use. Yeah, I'm sorry, it's one of those things. It would take half an hour to try and unpick the kind of concordance and differences between the two things. As I said, in a way, if you reduce the ecological footprint, then you are automatically reducing the opportunity costs. As I said, if we all went vegan, for example. And so it's very similar in that respect. The interesting thing I think about this study that may be slightly different is that it focused not so much entirely on how much, but also on where. And so there's this tendency when you say we're protecting the Amazon, for somebody to say, oh, but the whole of the Amazon could be put into production tomorrow, which is actually not true, because if you did that, then the global market for soybeans and beef would completely tank. There would be no value and everybody would lose money. And so what we do is we actually say, if you simply, this is more like the mitigation hierarchy, if you simply moved your production somewhere less harmful and allowed nature's services to then generate some revenue in ways that actually don't really have this footprint in such a big way, then you get an interesting jigsaw on the planet where things work out better for you, but just by moving things around rather than by actually reducing. So you could regard it as a sort of, ours is a step toward, I mean, 30 by 30 is a step towards a bigger ambition. And to some degree, the idea of moving your production first and then reducing it over the longer term could also be seen as a stepping stones in a policy trajectory. Yeah.
Thank you. That's an interesting observation. Cheers.
Hi, Piero.
Thank you. Thank you both for your question. We can go to the next one. Is by Adrian Viputra. Would you like to ask it yourself, Adrian?
Sure. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah. Thank you for the wonderful presentation. I'm curious if there's any plans to downscale the analysis to a couple of pilot countries, because I think it will be interesting to learn from the process when you and your team try to convince these important findings to the real world decision makers.
Right. Well, currently we don't have any funding to do anything else, I'm afraid. So there are no further plans. There might be a plan of asking where might the additional startup funding come from, but that's all that there seems to be interest for. It's also, there's something I forgot to mention. So there's actually two major cautions or caveats that you need to apply. The first is that even though a country's agricultural industry might be slightly better off, or at least no worse off, the same is not true of an individual smallholder who's suddenly told that he can't grow any more food beyond what he's already able to grow. Yeah. So there are local costs that don't appear when you look at national level. There are national costs when you don't appear when you look at global level. And so one of the most interesting warnings, there is something called the last, well, which I call the last mover advantage. And this is really important. So think about this. If one country protects a lot more land, it will create a slight food scarcity, which will push up the value of any food production and the value of land. But it will mostly push up the value of food production in the neighboring country. So your neighbor will benefit from your generosity. If that neighbor then protects their land, then the third country along will have even greater increase in scarcity, even higher prices paid for its production, and will do even better. So if you think about that, you'd either have to be incredibly altruistic or incredibly non-economically trained to be the first country to protect your 30%. And the only way you can get around that is by putting in place either an immediate global consensus or by putting compensation that overcomes the last mover advantage. So instead, the first person to move gets the first mover advantage. And that can be partly done by actual direct compensation and partly by this idea that the first people who increase their nature tourism will tend to build a moat. So that, you know, there'll be no.
Thanks very much.
Can go to the next question. Anigo, would you like to ask Inigo Home the next question on the list? Of use would be allowed in such areas. So I'm assuming, like, what level of protection are we talking about, or is assumed in the model?
That's for the policymakers to decide. All the models assume is that the kind of balance of uses that already exists would be more or less just multiplied upwards. So some protected areas allow you to, you know, have sustainable logging. We assume that that might go, and let's assume that that's 10%. We would assume that it would be 10% of a bigger system, and so on. Oh, sorry. The only thing I would say is the marine side is different. So you may not be aware of this, but even like in British marine protected areas, you can go off the coast of the British Isles, which you might think is patrolled by the Royal Navy, etc., to a marine protected area, and you can find a Dutch super trawler fishing in the middle of it. Fishing is extremely common currently in marine protected areas, including, you know, dragnet trawling, which damages not just the fish but the entire substrate of the sea. So obviously, to some degree, the idea for the marine protected areas is they should actually be protected. We ran two models, one in which you could sustainably fish, but emphasis on sustainably, so maximum sustainable yield, half of the area, and the other half was no take. And the other scenarios where the whole thing is no take. And typically what happens is the more no take there is, the more short-term pain you have, and the more long-term gain you have because the fish stocks recover. The more you allow some fishing, you don't have short-term pain, but nothing ever recovers. So.
Thank you. The next question was from Lebo Shiro. Would you like to unmute yourself and ask your question directly to Anthony? Okay, I'll ask this one as well. Yeah, please go on. Sorry.
Okay, yes. I just wanted to ask, because we can't disregard climate change when we talk about nature conservation. The two are interlinked, and dependent on each other. So how do we reconcile nature-based tourism, which is now highly travel heavy, as leisure travel for mostly people from developed countries, going to, I'm from Africa, for example, from Botswana, and we are highly dependent on nature-based tourism. But with the kind of work that needs to be done with climate change in terms of cutting emissions. How does this now work?
Well, you're quite right, and you might well ask the question asked by people going to international meetings on climate change, which is, you know, the set of people in this room probably just added 0.1 of a degree centigrade to the Earth just by traveling here. How does that even figure? So it's like a joke, basically, every time you go to one of these things. It is, so to some degree, you're straying onto the field of ethics and you know, utilitarian concepts of the greatest good and what it's reasonable to do in order to achieve the greatest good. And so, you know, the idea, obviously, of people flying to climate conferences is, yes, we may have done some damage, but overall net, we hope we're doing some good. Comments on a postcard about whether that's a valid point of view. So it's a similar idea, like, and you could in fact monetize that. So given that conservation is underfunded, and we know that underfunded conservation tends to lose things like forests faster, then you could argue that if the people who are generating emissions then helped us to avoid emissions by adding into the funding of that, then maybe at least you get a net zero in that respect. So you've got a sort of a bit of a net zero offset economic picture and a bit of an ethical picture of, you know, do we do a small amount of damage to hopefully do a greater amount of good?
Thank you, Anthony. Just, I know you've been talking for a long while. Are you all right to take 2 more questions?
Yeah.
Yeah, we're almost running. We have 1 minute left. So the next question is, it was by Stephen Opel. Would you like to ask your question directly, Stephen?
Hi, thanks, Andrew. That was a fantastic presentation, and it's great to see that there will be both a few costs and some benefits. What I'm interested in is whether the costs and benefits will be equally distributed, or whether you can envision that some stakeholders may disproportionately incur the costs of any protected area expansion, and may therefore be more inclined to oppose any of those scenarios because they do not benefit. So I could envision that oil and mining companies might disproportionately incur costs because they have fewer areas to access, but they may not reap any of the benefits that you described. The same, I think Bruce asked about indigenous people who live in the more natural areas, and they might actually incur more costs rather than benefits. Can you make any speculations about that? How the costs and benefits might be distributed?
Yes, to some degree, these are the caveats that I spoke of before, that a local smallholder. So do you remember I was saying sometimes in terms of agriculture, the question is, could you simply grow that food somewhere else that's less damaging to biodiversity? And that's essentially what our models attempt to do. And that's why you don't get this giant national opportunity cost to agriculture, because essentially you're just moving it somewhere else. But that's not helpful to the farmer that lived in that one particular village and wanted to grow food in that one particular place. So obviously there are local opportunity costs. Clearly the balance in pure economic terms is the balance between essentially the ability of nature to generate income, which is largely based on tourism and carbon credits and perhaps some water payments in the current market, and the opportunity cost. Now, obviously, if you're in a country where there's no carbon market, no water market, and no tourism, but you lose agriculture nevertheless, you're going to lose. Yeah, you're going to have a negative outcome, which is why our costs include compensation costs that need to be paid to essentially balance this out at an international level. Now, of course, the people who are going to oppose that are the people who are having to pay out to the countries that are in a negative position, and so on. It goes on forever. Of course, there's all of these things, and yes, oil and gas, obviously, things like oil and gas, you get to the point where you have to move away from economics and talk about regulation. It's like, you can't just have an economic reason not to have Deepwater Horizon. You have to have just a law that says you can't do it.
Thank you, Anthony. Actually, we evaluated our time constraint. I think we just went over our time limit. Thank you very much for accepting our invitation. There are several questions that remain unanswered. If you want, you can message directly Anthony. His profile is on the website. But again, thank you very much. It was a very good talk. And for everyone, if you next week at the same time, we have another seminar, the next one in our series, which will talk about what are the effects of COVID on conservation, and this will be a panel discussion. So feel free to join there, and yeah, have a good evening. Thank you again for joining. Goodbye.